time to get started on this live stream, everyone. We've got the Nutmeg, and we have the doors open on the Nutmeg Tavern, so you can come on in, find a seat. We're going to have a lot of images to look at today. We've got a lot of tech talk, for the 18th century at least. I'm your host, John Townsend, and we're going to be talking about fun 18th century stuff. I am joined behind the scenes, on the other side of the time vortex, by Lauren.
Hello.
And Ivy's on the console.
Hi, everyone.
And they are going to be doing the hard work back there while I do the easy work over here.
Sure.
Tech stuff is always, it's something I love to look into, whether it's old technology or new technology. It's one of those things I have fun with. And wait, before we do that, let's talk about the occasionally people send those things in for fun, and somebody sent in a watercolor, right?
Yes,
Do I have
it's up on the mantle.
Oh, it's up on the
figured
there it is.
It's a little hard to see things on camera, so we have a slide of it.
There you go. There's a slide of it. Watercolor is really interesting. It's usually something you do in like a landscape.
I generally do. I've never done a
portraiture.
person. I was very impressed.
Right. So there you go. That was sent in by
Kristen.
Kristen.
Thank you so much.
There we go. So thank you so much for that. Wanted to get that before I forgot it. So many things are kind of packed into today. Is there anything else before I jump into what we're doing?
Stone's Trace, I thought.
Yeah, so last week's video, the one that came out on Sunday, was beef a la mode, which is sort of like a stuffed pot roast. YouTube isn't loving it, but it was really good. Really interesting recipe, and one that I've probably read, 100 times and ignored. And then it's like, wait, this one's really interesting in that it shows up so many different places, and it's kind of a little different than what people would do today. So, real fun episode. This weekend, Stone's Trace is happening. I won't be there, but Ryan will be there selling coffee. You can say hi to Ryan. That's in northern Indiana here, in Ligonier, Indiana, at the Stone's Trace Tavern historic site. And if you're interested in historic events happening in your area, you might want to check out reenacting schedule.
Yes.
.org.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So many permutations. And you can look for events in your area, or if you're somebody who does events and you want to have your event on that calendar, you can put that up. Done by Frank Jarbo. He does an excellent job with that site, so make sure to check that out. Let's talk about high-tech stuff happening in the 18th century, or at least high-tech for the 18th century. And we kind of, sometimes we can look at people 200 years ago or 300 years ago, and we can say, they were like just barely one step above cavemen. They're just, they were wearing drab clothing, and they're all just banging on sticks or using the most, simplest tools ever. But really the 18th century is when technology and different technological things really starts to take off. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we kind of stick with the 18th century in some ways, because it's that crossroads between the old world technology and new technology. So we can really see what's happening in the changes in society and in everything that happens with people. From the beginning of the 18th century to the end of the 18th century, we can see a very large change. And so societal things, political things, but we're going to be talking about technology and lots of different kinds of technology. And when you start to think about that, the reason why you get more technology is because people start to have more time. And the same thing with like leisure time is one of those things that really starts to happen maybe just a little bit in the 18th century, more likely in the 19th century. And you have that because of greater production. And the first place where you have to have greater production is agriculture. So it starts with agriculture and the innovations that happen with that. And then as people don't have to spend as much time making food, they can start to do other things. And the 18th century is interesting, even in America, in that the vast majority of people are working in agriculture on farms or in some avenue of agriculture. So like 90% of people are farmers or connected with farmers, and just a smaller portion are craftspeople or merchants. And that really starts to change as people get more into, we get the factory mindset and people start manufacturing more and more things because we have technology. So let's jump into some wonderful slides, and that will lead me into 1,000,001 things to talk about. We do have, really, if we look at most industries, even in the 18th century, farming included, like this slide, most people are working with their hands. They are using simple hand tools, and most of the power is human power. I mean, in this case, part of agriculture, we have horses and oxen pulling things, but for the most part, the power is coming from the people themselves with the simplest tools ever. But one of the things that happens in the very beginning of the 18th century, in something like 1701, we have the invention of the drill. And that is a seeding implement. So we start to see innovations in agriculture with items like this, where it goes through the field, it's being pulled, and the seeds drop in at a very regular interval, and it gives you, row crops and all this, that if you didn't do it that way, you would have to hand plant them individually, and they wouldn't be even, and you wouldn't have a crop that is in this way. You can make it so you can try to figure out the most productive way, the best distance for the plants apart and all this good stuff. That would be much more difficult if you were doing by hand. We also start to get innovations in agriculture later on with their reapers and things like that help you with the harvesting of the plants. Now, once you have the plants harvested, is there happening after, say, it's harvested? And we do have some of the high technology of grinding of grains. Now, windmills, they are not, windmill like this isn't new to the 18th century. These are been happening since, the 14th century and earlier than that. But we have this is, fairly complex and high technology for the 18th century. Even then, this is a post mill, and it is a wind-powered mill, and you can see all the gears and the grinding and the millstones and everything. Now, these are, in one sense, simple and old but high technology for the time period. But we do have other things we're doing with that. Another kind of mill that possibly even earlier than windmill is a water mill with a vertical, instead of a water wheel like we normally think of. This is a turbine water wheel that's going through here. Now, this is one of the interesting things. Most of these images we're going to see here, almost all of them, are from Diderot's encyclopedia of the late 18th century. And this one caught me off guard when I first started looking at Diderot's 20 and 30 years ago. And I never really thought they would have water turbines in the 18th century or before that. But yes, they've got it. You don't have as much, you don't have any gearing. This is a direct, the power comes directly from the turbine and goes up to the grindstones. So this is a little bit more less powerful way, and maybe even a simple mechanism really here. The water kind of gets channeled and shoots down through the turbine. The power goes straight up the shaft into the grinding stones, and then we have a little bit of levers that change how tight the stones are together. And that's about it. So most of the work is, how do I get the water channeled into this? Now this one is a very complex mill here. There were very simple versions of this, and some even in like frontier America, having simple tub mills, they would call it, or something like that. And here we have an innovation that's happening in the 18th century, which is, how can we take, here's a water mill for grinding grain, and how do we run the grain through the mill to do all these things without having as much human power as possible? And so they came up with this idea for a mill that's multiple stories, and the grain would go up and down in this mill. So they would take the grain from the very top, and they would send it through the different mechanisms that would take the chaff off, and then send it through the grinder. And then when it went through the grinder at the very bottom, you can't see it in this image, but in some mills, it would get sent back up in these little tiny elevators to the top again to go through more of the mechanical process that would bolt the grain or bolt the flour down to the finest, or take the bran away and separate it and do all these different things. So there's a lot of innovation happening here in just the food section of society and something like a mill. The other huge portion of the economy in the 18th century is cloth and clothing. And we have tremendous gains in technology happening in the 18th century with cloth. And, it's interesting that it's like one innovation leads to the next. So the first thing that's happening here in the 18th century with cloth is a special loom adaptation. So this slide is talking about the flying shuttle that was developed in 1733. And it's a special way of having the shuttle, which takes the weft part of the weaving, and it's got you can see the shuttle down here in the bottom right hand corner, and let's see, it's John Kay that comes up with this flying shuttle idea. How can I make this so that I don't have to move it with my hand and do this operation? So when you weave, it's all put on the loom, and you use the beater, and then you slide the shuttle from one side to the other, and you use the beater and you slide it back. Well, he came up with this idea that if the shuttle rode inside of the beater, and I could just hit this kind of a rope, twitch it from one side to the other with just one quick movement of the hand, it would shoot the shuttle to the other side. And you could weave 4 and 5 times faster.
I imagine that would be such a wonderful innovation.
Right. So Lauren does weaving with a little inkle loom.
Right, and it's not a very wide weft,
no.
The one I'm doing. But if you were doing this width, that would be such an impressive innovation. Right. Although I can imagine that at the time, if it happened, I would grumble about it, yes.
Right. It's like somebody's mechanized.
Yes.
Well, as soon as Kay comes up with the idea of this loom that speeds up the weaving process, guess what gets hurt next? They start to run out of thread. It's like we can't make thread fast enough for the looms. And so that drives the next innovation or next high technology movement. And that is, how can we spin thread faster? And so this person comes up with the idea of this spinning jenny, which makes it so you can spin multiple cones of yarn, or thread, I guess in this case you would call it, at once. Can I do it 5 at once? How about 10 or 20 or 30 at once? So he invents this spinning jenny, but he doesn't release the idea. He spins all this thread at home, right? Keeping it a secret for as long as possible, because everybody else it's priced like you only make it one at a time. So if you can make it 20 at a time, you can make big money. Well, people were really mad at him for doing this. They broke into his house and smashed all his machines.
Oh, I'm not sure that was the right response.
So he goes someplace else.
Why didn't they just steal the machines?
d-
That would have done them a whole lot more good.
Well, that's not what happened.
Well, but they might also, because they too could anticipate what was going to happen with Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Meaning that it would wipe out a lot of
It's putting people out of jobs.
Is. Right. And so they could see that coming up. So that might have been part of the motivation, along with knowing that he was using a technology that they did not have access to. Yeah.
Now, the spinning jenny isn't perfect. It doesn't make as strong a thread. And so you could only use this thread in the weft.
Yeah.
And the warp really needs a much more consistent, stronger thread. And so there's an innovation later on called this is like a mule jenny, or the spinning mule. And it has a way of sort of spinning and then going back and forth. It would just spin a section like 3 feet long, and then it would wind it up and start over again. And so the whole thing kind of rocks back and forth. And this one is just sort of like a side view, and you could see that it's a big old complicated machine. But they ended up making these so that this machine would be like 45 feet wide, and it would have hundreds and hundreds of spindles on it, and it would be spinning they would spin all these 400 across, or 100 across, and then 3 feet of it, and it would wind up, and it would move backwards and forwards, and it would just keep spinning more and more. And this was higher quality thread you could use on both kinds of things. Along with textiles, you've probably heard of jacquard looms, and it being the basis for punch cards, basically, and computerization. So this is what a kind of a jacquard kind of loom would be like before it was completely mechanized. That happens in like 1790s, where they start to really come up with and sort of perfect this idea. But this is a loom. This person is suspended over the loom, basically, and there would be a person here on the left-hand side that would be doing the looming work. You can see the beater there and kind of where he would sit. He's not there in this position. But to make these complicated patterns, the person down below would use the beater, and he would beat once, and then the person above here would change the pattern by hand.
Wow.
It's like, okay, I'm going to push these things up and down so that it turns out a particular little pattern, and then the person would send the thread over, and he'd beat once, and then the person would set this all up again.
That's such an interesting, because it's not, it's unusual for people to be in a teamed craft where one person has one particular part and then the other person does the other particular part, and they're two totally different aspects of it, and they just go back and forth.
So later on, we get the punch card thing where he gets replaced by these punch cards, basically, that do the work instead of the person who's suspended over this. Probably would be like a boy or a young person up there doing all this.
Yes.
And if they mess up the design, they get all that and all this. Now, this one, totally fascinating. So we have people at the store here that do knitting for hats, and we use some of the people hand knit the hats, and then we have hats that are made on a knitting machine. Well, this is a knitting machine operation from the 18th century. It's called a frame knitter, or frame knitting in the 18th century. He is doing stockings, which stockings are very finely done. So our hats are fairly coarse, stockings very fine. And he's working the machine over here. We can't see exactly how he runs it. On a knitting machine today, you have this sort of shuttle thing that you move back and forth. And I don't know. It's pretty much magic when you watch it happen.
That's what I say.
I mean, you move this thing back and forth.
I've been doing it for three.
Sure. At least 2, yeah.
At least 2 years. And I just barely have an idea of how this thing works.
You run it over and it magically...
I know how it works, but I don't know how the shuttle makes it work.
Right. Because you just move this thing back and forth and then the stuff comes out the bottom. You're just like, what's going on? Right? So this is somebody using a knitting machine from the 18th century. I do not know when they were invented. Here is the machine kind of more close up. And it vaguely resembles knitting machine from today, at least this idea that it's got all these little, I don't know, things going on across it. And here's kind of close up. So today you have these cams and things going on inside. This is kind of what they were vertical in this case. And you can see the little hooks where the yarn or the thread runs through them. And don't ask me, but somehow with the shapes, they kind of go up and down. You can see that on the left-hand side, they're sort of halfway up, and then on the right-hand side, they're down on another section of it. Anyway, this would make knitting happen automatically. Personally, I think knitting, even by hand, is pretty much magic. You're just taking one string and you're just kind of knotting it and it turns into something. I mean, I think that once people realize that this doesn't actually work, all our knitted garments are going to fall apart.
Oh no!
Just like poof. Because the belief isn't there anymore. Because I think belief
that's
is the only thing that holds them together. So there is high tech for the 18th century.
Do you want to drop it for a minute?
Yes.
You probably just did the Tinkerbell thing, and you probably made all of everyone's knitted garments fall apart.
We are going to be
Just
in
by
trouble
saying
now.
And today, I mean, what is knitted? All our T-shirts, our underwear, our stockings, our hats, everything. Poof! Half our clothing just disappears. What were you going to say, Lauren?
I was just going to catch up on a little bit. So,
Yes.
there's a super chat from Mandatory Carrie. Thank you. I will catch the rerun.
Wonderful.
Excellent. And then from Hamura Akemi 91, evening from the UK.
Yes.
And then there were just a couple chats that I wanted to touch on. So this one was from somebody who had done a paper on the spinning jenny when they were doing,
right.
which that would be such a fascinating topic if you were going to do that. And let's see if I can find it specifically. Okay, I did a history project on the cotton jenny. Perfect choice. And then, so did you know that Hilary Wagner mentioned earlier that they'd been recording all day on their new CD.
Good.
Have you heard anything?
No, I haven't heard anything.
It sounds great. Ryan had mentioned it to me,
Yeah.
so I'm very excited. That's going to be great. And somebody else had mentioned that there was a working mill in, where was it? Let's see if I can find it. A mill in a Swiss museum that uses a turbine.
Okay.
And then somebody else had mentioned a different one, and that they had talked that it was still working and that they had taken it from one area or disassembled it or totally reassembled it somewhere else. Right. So that sounded like such a fun project. We had gotten to see a mill in when we had gone out to visit
Plymouth Plantation?
Yes.
Right.
And it was very impressive, especially, I'm so used to metal machines. And whenever I see a wood one, it's just
pretty neat.
The next level of somebody going to that effort for something that takes a lot more upkeep because it's wooden and it wears out a lot quicker. And it still was worth the time. Absolutely. Okay, I think those are the ones I wanted to touch on.
Wonderful. We'll jump back in. One of the fun high-tech things that's going on here is they're working on pneumatics, and this is an air rifle from at least an image from Diderot's Encyclopedia of an air rifle of the 18th century. And, you see them. They're actually kind of, you see some early ones in Europe. Lewis and Clark had an air gun that they took on their trip, and they impressed a lot of the Native Americans because it was quiet, and they were able to shoot this thing without any gunpowder or anything. It was very interesting innovation or high tech, right? I didn't find a lot about this. I didn't read a lot about it, but I believe it is working on a calculating machine here. So it's the mechanics of a calculating machine or a counter of some type. They had a lot of, very intricate clockwork and watch things that are going on in the 18th century. We've got here's a little bit, it's like, I don't know if I would necessarily call this high tech, but certainly compared to some ways of doing the pressing work. When there's like a lot of industrial things, we need to squeeze something really, really hard. Maybe we're squeezing fabric or leather or, all sorts of different processes need that. And here we see, now there are some of these like giant press machines, say like you're squeezing, grape juice out, grape juice out of grapes or something, and they would have water-powered presses. Here's a person-powered press, and they are squeezing, I don't know what in this one. I didn't write down exactly what it is. It could be something as simple as paper or leather or something like that, but we can see how it goes through multiple pulleys, and they have to have a special frame, and everything all works together. And the person just walks on that wheel and squeezes it down until the job is done, and then maybe they hold it tight for a period of time, or maybe all they need to do is just squeeze it once and then let off. You were talking about teams of people working together. Mm-hmm. We have the heavy industry here of multiple teams working together, and these people are forging a giant anchor. Oh. And the anchor on a ship is huge, and it is very, very heavy. And they have to forge it all together. And we can see on the extreme right hand or left-hand side, we have a giant trip hammer. And these trip hammers were most likely water-powered, and it would revolve this wheel, and it would have a little kind of peg that stuck out the side of the wheel, and this giant hammer was resting beside that wheel, and that little peg would come around as it turned and pick up the hammer, and then as soon as the peg was past a particular spot, the hammer would drop down, wham, and it would hammer on that. So we don't have people hammering, we've got giant trip hammers. There are a lot of trip hammers that they show in Diderot's Encyclopedia. And here they've got multiple wooden cranes like a giant fireplace crane.
Oh.
See what they're right here on the very extreme right-hand side?
Yes.
That's a huge wooden
huge.
fireplace crane, right? And it's holding up one part. There's another crane on the other side. The other two guys are holding the shaft of the anchor, and they're putting that together and forging it. And I mean, that's some heavy industry for basically people work. There are no big machines in there except for the
it's
giant
just
hammer.
people moving it around. I'm assuming that the reason that they have to do it all in one piece is for strength.
Yes.
There's no other way that it would be strong enough to do its job.
Exactly. We also have here people working together in teams, and they are using a fly press they're actually coining money in this case. There's a little die, and basically like a punch and a die that's in the center there with this little person who's in the pit. And these guys, they pull on the cords, and the weight takes over, and that thing comes around and smashes it. Now, you don't want to have your hand in the way when that's happening.
No.
But I'm sure that would never happen. Nobody would ever get hurt like that.
Never.
But they are coining money with this huge high technology press. Now, yes?
There was a question that I find very significant. So YJ says any hearing protection, and then Ursatsi says, "Huh? YJ, what'd you say?"
Yeah, what? I can't hear you.
And that's something, because even just our little knitting machine, it's pretty noisy when you're doing the main task. Have you run across anybody talking about that?
No, they were just deaf. I mean, even the people running cannons and canning crews and all this stuff, they didn't have any
hearing protection at all.
I mean, they might put like a cloth around their head that it would slightly muffle it, but they would just talk loud for the next couple of days, and undoubtedly they lost a lot of their hearing. None of these things, if we look back at some of the machines that we've looked at, none of this is really capable unless we get more and more precision machines to create the machines. And this is a lathe, a metal lathe from the time period. You can see on the left-hand side, the foot pedal, so we're seeing like through two different views of it, but it's just a foot powered lathe. It runs we just do the foot pedal and it runs the upper wheel, and that has little belts that run the lower wheel, which is actually engaging with the piece we're doing, creating. And some of this is freehand work, but there's also the mechanism for making this much more rigid to do very high precision work, so they could make more and more fancy machines. Here is kind of like a following lathe. This is a lathe that's made to put this intricate design on a metal plate from the time period. So we can see the plate over here on the right hand side, and just outside of the plate is the pattern for the plate. And so what you would do is you'd set the plate in there, and you would put the tool against the pattern, and then you would be able to turn that big crank, and it would make this intricate design on the inner plate. So it changed that. Again, more special high tech. And here are people making the screws that you would need. So if you remember from the pasta press, where Brandon showed the making of a wooden screw for that wooden press, they're doing the similar kinds of things here. They're making screws for presses and other sorts of tools. Probably these are wooden screws and not metal screws, but they with some of the metal screws, you have to have sort of the same kind of a following lathe that would create the threads on these metal screws. A lot of those screws from the 18th century, especially something like the little screws in your gun, wood screws, those had all threads cut by hand. You'd have somebody, they'd have a little piece of metal in a vise, and they'd be filing away, and they would make the threads by hand. You can see how having a machine make them would be, well, it would be like going from, 1 an hour to 100 an hour.
I'm always so surprised, because I do enjoy doing things by hand, but I often I'm not very patient about it, so I often won't take the time to do something more complex. So I'm always, in awe of the people who are going this extra mile to create something, just taking the time to make to this precision that's going to make it just that little bit better.
Yeah, and how do you, it's hard to believe. It's like, oh wait, I lost the screw out of my gun.
I'll just make myself
3 hours later, here's my new one. The not quite steam engine is invented here in the 18th century. 1712, Thomas Newcomen makes an atmospheric engine, and this is an atmospheric engine here. And an atmospheric engine actually uses the atmospheric pressure to move that. So it kind of heats a plate that, it's the steam condensing basically that makes the power instead of the pressure of the steam being used. So it's kind of like a backward steam engine, but it works. And that's where it starts out. And these are they're giant, and they're generally used to pump water out of mines in the 18th century. That's the big use for an engine like this. But that is some heavy duty technology change compared to what we were doing with, people doing all the work, or horses going around and around, or windmills or water mills, which is basically the only power that you have to work with before that. So this is, huge change. But one of the neat things about this is this one, which is not about the pumping that's happening here on the right-hand side, but about what's happening on the left-hand side. This set of rods and sort of angled things here, it's kind of hard to interpret it, what's happening here. But this is a method of power transportation. Or in other words, how do I move power? Transmission is what I really want to say. How do I move power from one area to another? Our windmills, and especially our water mills, are very, very fixed in their location. But what if I want to do some kind of power, a mile away or 500 feet away? How do I move the power from up on the top of the hill where the windmill is down to the valley? And they use these series of rods and posts and I don't know what you would call them, levers to, it would push and pull. One side would push, and then, 10 seconds later it would pull. And it would transmit this power, around curves and bends and up and down to do things, to send that power someplace else. And I wish there was a better way to describe it, but one of those sort of crazy high technology, now today low technology things that is happening in the 18th century. There's an interesting German name for it I don't have here for it, but just very, very just crazy to think about how it's like, how do we move this power from one place to another? This machine I was fascinated by. I've seen the picture many times, and it's like, okay, now what's going on? Now, what happens if you are? Don't ask me why they would need to do this, but there were multiple pile driving machines in Diderot's encyclopedia. When you want to put a pier in, whatever, you had to have these machines that would drive piles down in. Well, this is a machine that cuts the piles off underwater. It's an underwater saw. Wow. So there's this upper platform with these ratchets and tools and things that go back and forth. And then down below, we have this sets of gears. So if you look at it on the left-hand side, it's like a giant hacksaw. And there's two little arms that pinch the post that you want to cut.
Okay.
And then it moves the saw into position, and somebody on that top platform up here at the top is moving the saw blade back and forth, and it cuts them off at a very, very particular height. So
I would not have thought they would have had that type of tech. Underwater especially.
Right, underwater automatic sort of sawing apparatus. It's like, okay, guys, that's crazy. So there it is. You see the gears and the saw blade and all that good stuff.
Okay, do you want to pause for a second?
Yes.
Okay, so Homura Akemi 91 has a super chat, and it's, so for 18th century soldiers, was hearing loss just an occupational hazard? Surely landed gentry types hunting would be able to afford some kind of hearing protection. And then a couple people weighed in, and one person was saying that the awareness was probably quite a bit lower in the time period about, not that some people wouldn't have been aware, doctors especially, would have probably seen it repeated, but that other people might not have known to be as careful of hearing protection.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, especially during warfare, you don't have time for a lot of safety, this or that. So if you're on board ship, They don't have a good way of dealing with that. Now, in the Aubrey Maturin series, I haven't done the research on this. So in the Aubrey Maturin series, Dr. Maturin uses balls of wax that he puts in his ears to make it so it's quieter, so he can sleep and in loud situations. But I don't know that that's a common situation, and I think they mostly just kind of, it's like, well, you're a person who shoots off cannons. You're not going to be able to hear very well.
Right. And I'll use my grandma's example. So sometimes it depends on the individual person, because grandma worked in a factory,
Yes.
and many, many years ago, and it was required that they had hearing protection. This was kind of an early, it wasn't as common back then for it to be a rule, but it was in this particular factory. And most people would just shy around the rule and not do it. And grandma, she used her hearing protection.
And she can still hear.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Yeah, maybe there's a lot of machismo that keeps you from using safety equipment. I can hardly believe that. I can hardly believe it. Navigation. The sextant here in this image is an innovation from the 18th century. They had similar, less able tools from earlier than that, backstaffs and quadrants and things like that. But this is the innovation that happens here in the 18th century. And look at that. Actually, we don't have to look at a picture of one. We've got one right here. Probably early 19th century. The box is marked 1790, so it could be from 1790. But you use this looking through the little hole, and you use this little lever here, and you move the mirrors around at the top, and you can see the horizon, and then it will show you the altitude of the sun. If you move this around until the sun lines up with the horizon, then you can look at the readings at the bottom here, and it'll tell you exactly what the elevation is on the sun, which is one of those ways of knowing where you're at on the face of the earth. But it's only helpful, well, it's not only helpful, but one of the other ways of knowing where you're at is by having a very, very precision time. So that's one of the other innovations happening. High tech for the 18th century, the things that are happening with building ships in the time period, very, very important. Being able to build them so that they're stronger, so that they're faster, and the innovations happening in the 18th century and in the early 19th century of refitting ships. So the problem is ships go bad. Very rare. They're very expensive. They're huge. They're hard to repair. And there's literally tons and tons of wood in them. And it's going bad all the time. And so we have innovations in and high-tech repair work that's happening on ships. The innovation of putting copper on the outside of them to make them last longer and things like that. Here is a watch from the 18th century, and it's hard to imagine them making all the things to make a highly accurate watch in the time period. Now, that's just if you're on land and it's like, oh, I need a watch and I want to know what time it is. And there were lots of innovations in the escapements and in the type of gears and how to make them more and more accurate. And one of the important things that's going on is making chronometers in the time period. So in the 18th century, Harrison is the one who's developing the ultra accurate timepieces for onboard ship. If you know exactly when the sun hits the noon time and you know what time it is in Greenwich, you will know where you're at on the globe, at least in one direction, right? And Harrison comes up with the first chronometer, which is huge. It's like 5 foot by 6 foot, and the H1. And H2 is a little bit smaller, and H3 is very much smaller. And H4, he's happening here in the later part of the 18th century, is about the size of a big pocket watch. I mean, he makes massive strides in how to get this super accurate, basically, watch happening in the 18th century. And we saw now each one of these gears, every tooth has to be made just right. It has to be made so that every tooth is exactly the same and the gap between every tooth is exactly the same. And how do you do that? Well, you've got special watchmaking machines that make the little tiny gears. We can see in the dead center of this, it's got a little 5 over it, is the gear that's being cut. Just one tooth.
Oh.
Right? And then you'd take the little thing away and you'd ratchet everything, and you could see the lower part here. There's a little peg and all these little holes around the outside, and that's how you index.
Oh, you're like, okay,
yeah.
and now we're moving to the next
Now
slot.
I'm cutting this tooth. Now I'm cutting that tooth.
Wow. Okay, one tooth at a time.
Yes, one tooth at a time. That's how you make it. Wow. We have high tech in optics, and we have the makings of cameras here. We have camera obscuras. So instead of having film, we have a person inside of a box who's drawing what he sees, right? So it puts the impression on the wall, basically, or down below you. And we also have people working on chemical things in the 18th century. There was a very important female chemist. Her husband was a chemist, she was a chemist, and she was doing all this work on trying to get these metallic colors to happen on fabrics. And she was, just doing tons and tons of experiments. And one person ran into her, a scientific person, and said, you ought to publish this. She publishes it, and a lot of what she does has to do with using sunlight and ultraviolet light to fix these colors. And it's some of the innovations or technological leaps that happen to make photography possible.
I'm always so delighted to see that when it's sort of accidental, how someone comes across something super practical. Like they were at times researching something completely different, and then they come across, then someone else, working in a different field like this comes along, and they're like, let's use it over here.
Right, like them figuring out how to vulcanize rubber. Whoops, an accident. It's like, oh, I burnt it up. Oh, it totally changed.
It's perfect.
Totally changed its composition. Loved this one. Was fascinating. This is a semaphore station. So how do we send information basically over a long period? So we think of telegraphs, electronic telegraphs. We use the internet today. They had the visual telegraph that was invented by the French in the late 18th century, 1790s. Now it's basically a reworking of the idea of flags at ships at sea. So the ships have been using that for a long time.
Yeah.
You're 10 miles away from some other ship, or maybe not quite so far, but 5 miles away. And how do I send a message? And they put up different kind of flags, and then you would be able to read it with your code book. Well, they thought, hey, what if we have all these towers, and they have these sort of flags going up and down, and they came up with whole sorts of different different ways to have these shutters and flags, and different ways to kind of send a message. But this is big. It's happening in the late 18th century. It's happening in the early 19th century. As soon as the French come up with it, the English and other places start to do the same thing. How can we send these messages about military things early on, and then regular commercial messages after that? So Lauren thought it was funny that that shows up in the Discworld series.
That's right. You immediately thought Dad mentioned stuff where I'm like, going postal. That's where I know, where I've seen it worked out, but in very fun ways. And he really explores it quite a bit, the whole system. So.
And none of this progress, it all happens very, very slowly unless you've got the high tech of printing. Going on. And when you can, again, transmit this knowledge into the future or around the world with books, that is a total game changer. And as much as this seems like a dirty and difficult and hot and sweaty job, it is, making things happen in the world that is really hard to believe. We have these books now, and we know about so many things now because these people were
working
printing
hard
it out and making it possible for all that. And this is probably one of the biggest innovations that happens in the 18th century is, no, that's not what's going on. Anyway, there we go.
I've got a couple different questions. So, this is from Macaroni Gluer, a super chat. Are there any technologies invented in the 18th century that are still in common use today? And a couple different people weigh in. Erstazi says the fire extinguisher, and then Katspa James says vaccines. So they still come through. So, and then Jay Corbett said that everything is so much improved in materials and processes that there may be a lot of innovations that happened that are so changed by the development that we wouldn't recognize them anymore.
Right. Yeah, I mean, really, just like I was talking about the cloth and one thing leading to another, then you have the changes that happen within those little innovations that, these are just the seeds of what we have today. And you can find the seeds of everything we do today, basically, back in the 18th century somewhere, depending on how you kind of look at it.
Right? That loom, is that, what my cell phone is.
Right.
Because...
Well, the guy invents the battery, basically, in the 18th century, right? It's like, well, he was trying to invent one thing, and then it's like, well, I take these different, dissimilar metals, and I put things between them, and all of a sudden, I've got a battery, or whatever. Sometimes they're just so simple, or so esoteric. So the reason why I've got this really wonderful camera lens here is because Dahlund helps come up with the chromatic lens in the 18th century, which makes it so that when the light shines through it, it doesn't have a rainbow effect. So a very, very simple lens always has these fuzzy images. So it's very hard to make a very precise and sharp camera lens unless it has the chromatics in there. And now we have special coatings on our lenses, and they're made of multiple different little pieces of glass so that it makes a very, very sharp image. And that's something that's happening in the 18th century.
And somebody else was asking if the lenses on the sextant were tinted to protect from...
Right. So depending on what you needed, they have different little things that flip up and down. So there's a colored green lens up here, and then this one is a red lens that you flip up, or a even darker lens. So you've got all these different lenses that flip up and keep you from blinding yourself. Now you might not need those if you're trying to get the altitude of the moon, depending on where you're at. And so yes, it's got all these different little special,
very helpful safety features.
I know where I'm at, but I'm blind.
And then Speed and Style Tony asked, did they use electricity for anything?
So they only had just basically come up with, obviously Franklin's working on electrical kind of innovations or understanding. But first you have to, there are some things that we know by trial and error. And they're so ubiquitous around us that we can start to build from these building blocks without knowing a lot about the underpinnings of what's happening. The electrical innovations are so simple in the 18th century that it's just like, what is electricity? How can I make it? Can I, they're first, figuring it out with static electricity, with lightning, and then they come up with the battery or the very, very primitive capacitor. But all the real kind of moving and shaking with electrical innovations and making it more applicable to work happens in the 19th century.
And then there's a super chat from Hexarcle. All the wood in these machines, and there are places where we might put a bearing or grease fitting today. How did they reduce friction at the time in wood machinery?
So one of the, if we go back, let me see if I can find it. Can we see it in the shot? So if you look, I don't have a close-up, but you see the top gear, the shaft with the gear on the windmill here. And there's the tail of that gear at the very back. And you can see how there are lines in it. Those are metal strips. So they didn't want the wood to wear out. So it's got a special material or special wooden block that's in the back, the bearing, and then these metal strips that are around the wood to keep it from wearing out. And the same thing is happening at the top of the shaft here, at the very front of the machine. And sometimes we use special woods like medlar or other things. We might use Babbitt metal in there, which is basically like pewter for our gears. So yeah, they had all kinds of different ways to kind of relieve the stress to keep the wood from wearing out.
Okay, so here's a super chat from Homura Akemi91. Do you think any industrial processes were better done in the 18th century than today?
I do not know. I haven't been, you can study them here, but it's hard to know what they were really like in the time period and what those processes are today. So I don't know. There probably were situations where today we've mechanized it to the point where there isn't the craftsman's touch in there. But even then, a whole lot of doing it a very, very precise way can make up for the craftsman's touch. So I don't.
That's true. There are certain pieces that I would value more if made in an 18th century manner,
Exactly.
like, say, a watch that was someone made this by hand, despite the fact that I can look at my phone and it will give me the exact time and the exact time anywhere in the world, and I just have to look around. But
Right.
I would value the watch more. It's sort of a different type of artisanship.
Yeah, I am waiting for the day when people start to reject the mass production. And I don't know that it will ever happen. But I mean, there's definitely a different worth to something when you know the person who's made it and how they made it and all that good stuff.
And often they can live side by side, where you have many pieces that are mass produced,
Yeah.
and then you have prized pieces that you've made yourself, or the craftsman, and they just live side by side and are they both have very important places in what you do.
That's a question that I would have to chew on, and there might be something that's like, well, they just don't make it like they used to, right? Whether that be because the material isn't available or an expertise isn't available, but I don't know.
The first thing that came to my mind was that concrete that the Romans made.
Well, there you go.
I mean, I think the Romans had all sorts of cool stuff.
Those Romans.
Well, and I was thinking about the masts on the tall ships, and that there are some things that it would be hard for us to replicate because the materials are lacking. Like, to find a tree that tall and old to create the mast for a tall ship would be, I imagine, pretty difficult now.
Yeah.
And that there are some things that the materials are.
Today we have to make composite masts out of multiple whatevers. Every week I try to get to the brand new Patreon and YouTube members, and of course I think there was a marathon and then I forgot it, so there's a bunch here. But that doesn't mean I don't appreciate them. Ben Edwards, The Best History Review. Nicole Littrell, Tyalun Chu, E. River Tree, Ken Archibald, Betty Stevenson, Jim, Kim Rowe, Rachel Bean, Ashley H., My Stridlery, something like that, Pygar 2, GM, Aggie Maggie, Windswept, Elizabeth Bush Ho, Kristen Ford, Dirty Mick 2, David Collar, Northern Wolf, and of course, here in the list is Deerskin Diary.
Mm-hmm.
Good job, Anthony. Special thank you to him for last week's live stream. And then brand new Patreon folks, Brandon Woods, James Robinson, Travis, somebody just the name F. Hastings, probably somebody who works with Hercule Poirot, and then James Barrow, John Morgan, and Samantha. So lots of wonderful Patreon Townsends Plus people. This episode is brought to you today by the Apothecary items here on Townsends, especially at townsends.us. What is it? Is this it? This is peppermint?
Yes.
Peppermint soap. It's new today, right?
Yes, it is. It came in the mail today.
Do I get to open this?
But yes, you can.
This is Dad's live reaction. Lauren wanted it, Dad, to smell
Dad's
it beforehand.
live reaction. No. It smells good enough to eat.
Don't eat it.
Except with a slightly bit of soapy. Have you guys tried this yet?
I have not tried eating it. I have tried some of the soaps, but not the peppermint yet.
Well, that's because it's brand new. It looks like there's peppermint in there. Mm-hmm. Super duper good. We were going to have all these cool, like high-tech jazz things here, like compasses and sundial, whatever. But I'll do them some other week. Last week, somebody asked about the leather canteen. Mm-hmm. The leather canteen is 9 inches tall, and 6 inches wide, and about 2 inches deep. And you can watch that video, and he shows you how to make it. Good job, Brandon. We've got, so this week's video coming up on the channel is not a regular video. It is a campfire cooking marathon on Sunday. So if you got some extra time on Sunday, you can watch a huge compilation of campfire cookings all strung together, and it's going to be a big video. It was one of those weeks when it's just like, you know what? We're going to have to put a marathon. So do we have any other thingies here?
Oh yes. There's a super chat from Tux and Bubba. Hi everyone. So do you want to go back to the car picture for just a second?
I can go back to the car picture. Oh, there it is. Ooh, more Ivy popped it up for me. We talked about I got this couple weeks ago, and I have fun driving it around. I don't dress like that when I'm driving around. I probably should.
Well, the hat might want to fly off.
The hat would definitely blow off.
2 seconds in.
If I wear a baseball cap, I have to make it squish on my head and make it not blow off. This is not an MGTD. It's an MGTD replica, probably made in the 80s, with a Volkswagen Beetle underneath as the base car, and I have a lot of fun driving that back and forth to work. Thankfully, I only drive 3 miles back and forth to work.
It's the perfect drive for this car.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
That's the kind of car you want to poop around, just like Toad Hall, having fun with your little car.
Mm-hmm. Pygar too was saying it's the Nutmeg Mobile.
Yes. Well, it does have that kind of
good,
nutmeggy look, doesn't it?
Sure does.
Yep. I've been thinking about repainting it, but maybe.
I don't know.
It's like, yeah, maybe I'll leave it nutmeg colored for a while. Did we do it? Do we have any other questions?
Well, were you tempted to sing Chitty Chitty Bang Bang while you were driving around in the car?
Ryan doesn't like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but I do. So.
I know. Every time I think I'm like, that's such a strange. It's okay. We've always liked Chitty Chitty.
I am.
It's probably
Cracktopus
time
Potts,
to watch it again. Yes.
Well, I hope Macaroni Glue you enjoy the marathon, because it's going to be fun. Those guys putting together those marathons, they do a great job, and probably the next cooking marathon, we are going to adapt it with some of the suggestions you guys had on the live stream a couple live streams ago. So, whew, we got some pretty beautiful weather out there. Lauren was down at Turkey Run.
Yes, I went down to Turkey Run for the day, and it was just like, I'd never been to Turkey Run before, and it was beautiful. The geography was very unlike normal Indiana, so it was beautiful to wander around in, and the weather was very kind.
Yep. Put the Nutmeg Tavern logo on the doors. Maybe I could get a magnet.
Yes.
Oh, I can't get a magnet because they're fiberglass doors.
We'll find a way. We'll just get a wood one.
Vinyl stickers or something. Right. Something like that. Well, folks, thank you for coming into the tavern today. It's a lot of fun, and there was so much to cover in this one. And, I just kind of skimmed over these. Any one of these technical innovations would be something that, they're so important that you can take hours covering them, but kind of getting the big view is fun. So, and so much. I mean, I had this list of crazy things that were made in the time period. One of the ones was the fire extinguisher they talked about, and diving bells, and thermometers, and lightning rods, and it's like it just goes on and on. So many things invented in the 18th century. So. You guys are so important to what happens here in the tavern and to what happens on the channel. So thank you for your kind support, monetarily and moral support in the chat and in the comment section, or just sharing our videos with other people. You make the channel happen. If it was just me, there wouldn't be any point in it at all. So thank you so much. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Ivy. And I hope you have a tremendous weekend. Thank you for watching.